Hi, in this video, I'm going to give you some tips for Essay 1, your analysis of a short story. So what I used to find myself doing is giving students a lot of the same feedback. So of course, I will give you individual feedback on your specific essay, but I found that I was always writing the same comments. So rather than constantly write the same comments, I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm looking for before your essay is due, a revolutionary idea so that you know what to avoid. So these are some of the most common mistakes that I notice in essay number 1. So a lot of students will have a hook that's just too broad or too sweeping. A hook that summarizes the story is not going to be the most effective way to begin. If you're going to summarize the story, you have to add something else too that pulls the reader in. A hook that begins with something like throughout the dawn of time or since the beginning of history, that's going to be way too sweeping. A hook that defines what literature is or defines what a story is going to seem kind of generic too. So when in doubt, start closer to your thesis than you think. Don't begin with kind of these generalized hooks. No transition between your hook and your thesis. Make sure there's some transitional word or phrase or just a natural segue from your hook into your thesis statement. Of course, make sure you include the author's name and the work in the intro. Remember, the first time you include the writer's name, you want to include the first name and the last name. Then throughout the rest of the essay, you just refer to the author by the last name. And then make sure you put the title of the short story like Blood Child or Hills Like White Elephants in quotation marks. Not italics, that's for novels or longer works. Short stories go in quotation marks. Avoid excessive summary. Like I said, a very short summary is okay. If it's a sentence, that's fine, but there's no reason to summarize the entire story. You can assume that the average reader would be able to read the story himself or herself, and I'm reading your essay, so I've read the story, no need to summarize. The biggest mistake is probably a thesis that's not debatable. By the way, all of these links are clickable, so you can click these and go back to lectures or examples for the ones that you see here in red, obviously. So make sure that your thesis is something that a reasonable person who's read the same story could say, wait a minute, I disagree with that, or okay, I agree with X, but I disagree with Y. If everyone who reads your thesis says, yeah, that's true of the story, that actually means that your thesis is not debatable, and that means it's not really worth arguing, right? There's no point arguing something that all readers already agree with. Try adding an although clause or an in order to or a because. You can't just add these words in and then call it a day. You have to make sure that you're doing the hard work of adding the analytical component or the counter-argument component. But I find that thesis statements that use words like that, those thesis statements tend to be more debatable and more analytical. And when you add an although, you reference other common interpretations. You might even reference what another critic has had to say, and then you explain how your essay is going to depart from that. But of course, you never want to announce. You don't want to say something like my essay will be about or my thesis is. That's just something that we don't do in academic essays. Add the significance or the so what. I have a whole lecture on that that you can go back and take a look at. So that means getting at some of the bigger themes of the story. So why does understanding a particular character, how does that reveal something about the story? Maybe connect it to the thematic significance. And this part has to be specific, right? It's not enough to just say something like, this symbol connects to an important theme, right? That's true of pretty much every story that has a symbol in it. So you want to make sure that your so what or your thematic significance is specific to your story and not something incredibly obvious. Make it analytical by addressing how or why or so what questions. Remember, on the rubric for this assignment, you'll see that I'm looking for an analytical thesis statement. And like I said already, try forming the counter-argument. You can include the counter-argument in your thesis or as a build-up to your thesis or maybe even as your hook. That will make it clear that your thesis really is debatable, right, if you reference that counter-argument. If you can't form a counter-argument that seems reasonable, it means that your thesis just isn't debatable enough yet. Look for your thesis and your conclusion. A lot of times, students will talk to me in office hours and they'll say, "I'm not exactly sure what my thesis is." So I'll say something like, just tell me your thesis in your own words. Don't read it, just tell me what you're writing about. Tell me what you're arguing. And they have trouble articulating it. But I find that when I get to the end of their rough draft and I look at the conclusion, I can pull out what the thesis statement is. So if you're not sure exactly how to articulate your thesis, you have a rough sense of what it is, but you need to make it much more precise, look to your conclusion and see if your thesis is buried in your conclusion. For body paragraphs, make sure that your topic sentences are subpoints of the thesis. A topic sentence should not be a plot point, what happened in the story, right? A topic sentence should be a subpoint of the thesis. That means your thesis is your overall argument of your essay, right? And each body paragraph is a small component of that. So your thesis should not be plot summary. Your topic sentence should not be plot summary. Your topic sentence should not be the same as your thesis because then it would be way too broad. Your topic sentence should be the appropriate scope. And your topic sentence is kind of like the mini thesis statement of that paragraph. So it should be something analytical and debatable too, not plot summary, not a quotation. Avoid using second person. I don't mark people down for this, but don't use you. It's just not customary in academic essays, especially in literary analysis essays. So you can say something like the reader or one. Avoid excessive praise of the story or the writer. Sometimes students will try to kind of pad their essay or fluff it up a little bit by praising the writer or by saying that the text was so wonderful or so thought-provoking. While I love hearing that, there's really no place for that in a literary analysis essay, and it just sort of reads like fluff. So I appreciate the sentiment, but I didn't write any of these stories, so there's no reason to make a note of how wonderful the stories are. If you want to leave me a little side comment about how much you enjoyed the story, awesome, I love that, but the essay itself is not the place to do that. Ignoring examples that contradict the thesis. This is something that's really tempting to do. You want to do the exact opposite, and this is kind of counterintuitive. Anytime you're making an argument, whether it's about literature or something else, you may be presented with evidence that challenges your argument, but it actually makes your argument seem weaker if you just ignore that evidence, if you ignore that glaring example or that glaring quotation that's going to kind of put a dent in your thesis. Now, it may mean, if you find enough examples like that, it may mean that you need to rethink your thesis. Maybe your argument is just not going to hold up. Or maybe it means that your thesis is a little bit more complex, that you want to make some sort of concession. So try to lean into those examples that challenge or complicate your thesis. That way, at least the reader is aware that you are aware that there are some contradictory examples, and you have to explain why the text still favors one reading or why you still favor one reading of the text. So make sure you don't ignore those examples altogether. Then it will look like you're just cherry picking and it'll weaken your argument. Don't gloss over quotations. I should have linked this too, but remember that you always need to introduce your quote, insert your quote, and then do the difficult work of unpacking your quote. So many times I'll be reading a student's essay for essay 1 and I'll think, okay, they've chosen a fantastic quote. This is really going to help prove their argument. And then there's one measly sentence of analysis, and they haven't done the difficult work, the really hard part of the essay, which is unpacking the quote, looking at key words, looking at figurative language, looking at syntax or whatever you're unpacking there, and connecting it back to your thesis. That's really what this essay is all about. It's about analyzing the quotations and connecting them to your argument. So don't assume that the quote speaks for itself. If you've chosen a quote and you feel like there's nothing to say about this quote speaks for itself, that means you haven't chosen the best quote. We are reading stories that are loaded with figurative language and really complex language too. So if you're picking a quote that just doesn't seem like it has much to unpack, pick a different one. I find that students who have the most compelling evidence often give me a really short quote, maybe just a couple of words, maybe half a sentence, a really short quote that's loaded with subtext or really rich language, and then they unpack it. You should always have more of your analysis than quotation. So if you're going to give me maybe a sentence of a quotation from the story, I should have at least 2 sentences or more of your analysis of that quote and how it ties back into the thesis. Avoid dropping quotations, a quote that hasn't been integrated, so introduced, inserted, analyzed, and of course there's a parenthetical citation there. A quote that has not been integrated is called a dropped quote, so please make sure you don't do that. No textual support given to prove the topic sentence in the thesis. Each body paragraph should have at least 1 quotation from the story as a rule of thumb. So make sure that all of your body paragraphs have evidence from the story, even if it's a really short quote that you're going to unpack thoroughly. And then, of course, what I find is that students will sometimes get tired. Maybe it's, 11 o'clock at night and the essay is due in an hour. They'll get tired and they'll give me kind of a lackluster conclusion, a conclusion that really just summarizes what they've already said and just repackages it. Remember, conclusions should go beyond that. Yes, they should echo your thesis, but they should also provide memorable closing words. And I know that can be really tricky and really challenging, especially when you're getting to the end of your essay. So please make sure you click this conclusion page to see some strategies and some ideas for how to conclude literary analysis essays. So I hope that helps. Hopefully I won't have to write these comments several times because you will have watched this lecture. Just one more thing to keep in mind. There's always room for improvement when it comes to your essays, and I tend to be a harder grader on essays than I am for, say, homeworks or discussions. So don't be discouraged. In fact, you should be encouraged if you see lots and lots of feedback from me on your essay itself and in your overview comments and on the rubric. Feedback is a good thing. I'm trying to help you improve for the next essay. So don't be discouraged if you see lots of feedback and suggestions. And also don't be discouraged if you have a grade on or you get a grade on your first essay that you're not happy with. There's still plenty of time to grow and improve throughout the semester. Okay, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.